Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out. My name is Caitlin Saladino. I'm the Director of Strategic Development here at Brookings Mountain West. And I want to welcome you formally to the start of the 2023 season of the Brookings Scholar Lecture Series here at UNLV. On behalf of my colleagues, Bill Brown, Ashley LeClaire, our Executive Director, Dave Demore, and our entire student research team, I want to thank you for coming out. We've hosted a number of public policy talks since the onset of the pandemic, but I'm happy to say tonight is actually the first lecture formally part of our Brookings Scholar Lecture Series since March of 2020, which seems impossible, but we're really excited that you all are here. Prior to the pandemic, we had recorded over 100 of the talks like the one you will hear tonight. And I will say that all of those are still viewable on our website, our YouTube page, and of course, occasionally through local public television if you're up late at night. Another thank you to our colleagues at Greenspun Hall through the UNLV TV program who are helping us to record this tonight. With their help, the lecture notes, the slides, and the video presentation from tonight will be available online on our website in about a week or so. So no need to sort of frantically write notes. They'll be available to you very soon on our site. Finally, before we get into introducing our speaker, I want to acknowledge that we have our inaugural Robert E. Lang Doctoral Fellow here with us tonight, Mallory Constantine. The Lang Fellowship was created in tribute to our founding executive director, Robert Lang, and it supports our outstanding doctoral students here at UNLV who are pursuing topics for their dissertation that are relevant to metropolitan and urban public policy, broadly speaking. We're really excited that Mallory is the first among this cohort. Her research is centered on vulnerable youths and the foster care system here in Las Vegas. And I think the topic of her study is something Rob would be very, very proud to support. So as we restart this important lecture series, I can think of no topic more important than the one we're actually going to discuss tonight with our colleague, Emily Markovich Morris. We're really excited that she's sharing with us some brand new data that has never been shared with any audience before. So our UNLV audience here tonight is the first to see this. And of course, her school and community-based research examines education institutions in 14 countries across 6 continents. As part of the Brookings Mountain West program, Emily has been talking to classes. She's here this week from the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., where she's a fellow in the Global Economy and Development Program and affiliated with the Center for Universal Education. I will very briefly give you a little bit of her background so you can understand why this talk's so important. She's a scholar and educator of comparative education and international development. Her research explores how to build collaborations between learning institutions, families, and communities to support marginalized youth in reaching their educational, work, and life aspirations. Her recent work centers on coordinating family engagement in education, and she leads research on leveraging family, school, community partnerships to transform educational systems. Prior to becoming a Brookings Fellow, Emily was based in East Africa for nearly a decade and helped establish a distance learning unit in the Ministry of Education and Vocational Training in Tanzania. She was the director of the International Training and Education Program at American University, where she also teaches. She has also served as a distance learning advisor for the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, Encompass LLC, Sesame Workshop, and other institutions during the COVID-19 pandemic. And she developed global guidance documents and toolkits to support policymakers, practitioners, and evaluators. Emily holds degrees from the University of Minnesota, American University, and Sarah Lawrence College. So like all our visiting scholars, Emily has been speaking to students, speaking to our colleagues here at UNLV, interacting with the stakeholders in our community, and learning as much as she possibly can about our university and our community over the last week. And now we get the great pleasure of learning a thing or two from her tonight. Following the talk, we'll have some time for Q&A, so hold your questions to then. There'll be plenty of time for some dialogue and some interactive elements throughout the lecture tonight. Without further ado, I will turn things over to Emily.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much to the faculty, to Brookings West, to the Lindsay Institute, and to all the students. This has been a great week of conversations and hearing your perspectives on how you see education, how you want to see education, that I will take back with me to the Brookings and in the work that I do. So thank you also for the students that have joined us today, and to colleagues from the Department of Education for joining as well, and for taking the time to also meet with me this week and help me understand the landscape and what's happening with family engagement in Nevada. So I will be talking about intentional conversations, and we'll make sure to leave enough time at the end because I can't present on intentional conversations and not have a conversation. So I'll leave time. I'm going to be talking to you about our process of co-creating family, school, and community engagement research that we've been doing together with our family, school, and community engagement team at the Brookings Institution and in our Center for Universal Education. I'm going to talk a little bit about why family, school, and community engagement is so critical to our education systems and to our work at Brookings of looking at education systems transformation. I'm going to share some of our current global research from 10 of the countries in the study so far. And as was mentioned, you are the first audience of this, so I'm very curious as we are developing the findings and how to make these findings useful for policymakers, for practitioners, for educators, and for researchers. And so I'll be sharing some of the recommendations, and I'm curious your feedback as well. So I'll start with this. Why family, school, and community engagement? And family, school, and community engagement can mean a lot of things, and it does mean a lot of things. But for us, it's really about how do we connect families, schools, and communities to support young people to thrive, to support students to thrive, and to support schools to thrive, and really centering students at the center of all of this work, and how in the different ways that we partner, the different ways that we collaborate to support young people to thrive. And so I'll be talking a little bit about these different ways in our research. I wanted to start kind of globally of how we're framing family, school, community engagement in the center of universal education and take us down to why I am in the space of family, school, and community engagement. And 2 weeks ago, we held the Sustainable Development Goal conversations at the United Nations General Assembly in New York. And 2 weeks ago, leaders from across the world came together and talked about the different 17 goals that together as a global environment hold us to improving systems, environment, gender equity, and education as being goal number 4. And that is inclusive and equitable and relevant education. And one of the things discussed in our current goal that was established in 2015 and is a commitment to 2030 is really where are we at? And we're finding across the world, countries are falling short. And what do we do and how do we go from there? And so for us in our work, family, school, community engagement has to be part of that work going forward and has to be part of ensuring that education is high quality, it is relevant, it is inclusive. And our work is also centered on looking at inequities and how family school engagement is so critical for addressing inequities and making sure all communities and all families feel like they can partner with schools and that we understand how to partner as school communities and as families in this work. So that's where I sort of start from. And in a recent study conducted by the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, they really highlighted a point that I thought was really important of why family school community engagement, which you'll see the acronym FSCE, family school community engagement, is so critical to quality of education. And so in a study they did in England, Estonia, and the United States, they looked at 5-year-olds and what were some of the factors that supported children from what they labeled as the most disadvantaged children, which are coming from the lowest quartile of socioeconomic status in these communities in England and US and in Estonia. What were the protective factors? And if you'll see the stars, 5 out of those 8 factors are directly related to the home environment, the relationship with families, the involvement of families. So I can't center enough of family school community engagement is so critical to quality of education. It's so critical to the inclusion in education, and it's so critical to making sure that kids have what they need to thrive and schools can thrive. What we have been, as a collective, thinking about and looking at in our research is really understanding how family school community engagement can vary by families and communities, even within communities, within families, even in the same neighborhoods, but also across the global community. But what we have found across is that engagement and partnerships are critical everywhere to student and school success. And as Dr. Karen Mapp would say, that we can have lots of different discussions and we can come from different perspectives, but we can agree that student and school success is really key to family, school, and community engagement. And so that is what we've also leaned into in our work, is how do we also find the commonalities and learn from each other in this process, in this collaborative process. I wanted to then narrow into the space of Nevada And a shout out to Alberto and the team at the Office of Parental Involvement and Family Engagement, that Nevada is an interesting space for us to understand globally and in the United States, because you have one of two states that have a legislative protected office that is dedicated to family school community engagement. That is unique to the United States, and you have bills in place that do encourage family school and community engagement to take place, and to make sure that teachers have family school community engagement as part of their education and their development and teaching practice, as well as not just in the public schools, but also in your charter schools. And some of the work that's happening of really coming up with educator training courses on family engagement is really important and unique for the United States, but also creating ways of sharing data and sharing data of what families are saying. So I wanted to just point out this and the toolkits and the thinking that has gone into really elevating family engagement and making sure it is part of an agenda that is part of Nevada. And so I think we have learned a lot at Brookings of understanding how Colorado and Nevada have worked towards making family school community engagement a commitment of the state. And so a lot of our research is now digging into also what does that look like in schools. So I'm going to go into why am I in family school community engagement. I wear a lot of different hats. I'm a researcher, so I look at what families, I look at communities, I look at young people, what are they saying, and the research on family engagement. And I'm wondering how many people here would identify as being a researcher. How many of you are seeing yourselves? Don't be shy. Yeah. We're all doing research and researchers. I show up as a teacher. I'm an educator. I work at American University. I started out also in Minneapolis Public Schools, working in education as a teacher, so I wear that perspective as well. I'm a parent to a child in the District of Columbia Public Schools, and I'm very involved in the local school advisory as a parent that is in the activism and helping make decisions. I'm wondering how many of us would identify here as teachers, how many teachers we have in the room, or started out in teaching. So I'm looking at others that I know started out in teaching. Important to the conversation. What about parents that are involved in schools as a parent? What about involved in some type of parent-teacher or advisory or activism group? Any of us, a couple of us, great. And then youth. I think I asked my mother, like, when did I start to be engaged in this conversation of family school engagement? And she reminded me of the time in 4th grade when I organized students across my public school about a gender stereotyping issue, and I took it to the principal with a number of others. So she said, I think it was 4th grade, but it might have been before. And so this has been part of my journey as also as a youth, as a young person, of finding my voice in this space. And so I can say probably it started maybe even earlier than 4th grade. So these are why I show up in the research, and I try to bring all of these different perspectives, because all of these different perspectives on education are so critical to family school and community engagement. So how are we at the Center for Universal Education contributing to research and practice on family, school, and community engagement? We are, we're working to foster collaboration and dialogues among and between families and schools, communities, and decision makers within communities, across communities, within states, across the global. So a lot of what we do is facilitating these dialogues. But we're also working to co-create a participatory and open source methodology, which I will share with you. The methodology where schools and educators get a chance to see themselves as researchers, where communities can be involved in the research process. And this was identified as an important need, and I'll talk a little bit about what makes this methodology and this participatory methodology so unique. And at the end of this year, our current methodology will be open source and available, and the research we're doing right now is working together to co-create and write this methodology and the different tools with the different 16 country partners that are working with us on this. And we're really also important to us is advancing research in communities that are experiencing some of the greatest inequities. So globally, this is looking at inequities in terms of race and ethnicity, language, socioeconomic status, gender, but also locations and locations across. And so learning and leaning into also within and students with disabilities. So we're also looking at how do we also advance research, and especially globally research, where there's a lot of research on family school community engagement in North America and Europe in Australia, but less so in countries in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia. And so also trying to advance global research on family, school, and community engagement that we all can benefit and learn from as a collective global community. So we are working as a network of family, school, community engagement, and it's a growing network. We work with over 50 collaborating organizations in our ongoing network that has been alive for the last over 3.5 years of really co-creating all of this research and working together. And in this current round, we have 16 countries that are in this research. And so those are starred. They're in all 6 continents. And in some cases, we're working directly with school districts and school leaders. And in some cases, we're working with community organizations that work with schools. But together, we're really advancing the research, creating open source tools, have a community of practice and dialogue across teams, and also thinking about what does that mean? How do we engage also this research with change and thinking about it in the public as well, and the conversations on family engagement and education in the public. We have a number of tools, and I have cards up here if you want to take kind of our QR code and look these up online later. We have our research playbook, which was in 2021, really our culminating research on family, school, and community engagement that was collected with our collaborative around the world. We have an interactive strategy finder where we collect strategies that are evidence-based of teams around the world that are doing strategies in a community setting, in a school setting, and are working to build family, school, community partnerships. And now we're working on the conversation starter tools, which I'll be talking about tonight in the research, which is really a methodology and a practice of doing research, participatory research with schools and communities to understand how do we build strategies for family engagement. So these are kind of the research and tools from the Center for Universal Education. And I'm going to talk a little bit now about this methodology, this conversation starter tool process. It is a participatory and mixed methodology where we start with contextualizing and looking at why our families and communities, what is the importance of doing this research? Why are organizations and school districts that we're working with interested in doing this work? What is their objectives in doing this research? And really thinking then about the demographics in the community and doing a lot of deep work on the contextualizing. We then have a process of surveying and analyzing beliefs and perspectives on education. And we've found that in family, school, community engagement, we often don't have a time or we don't put effort into understanding beliefs and perspectives and how we show up in education, and realizing that this is different for us as educators and families, and our experiences as parents or our own experiences with education systems will also influence how we see education. And we also have a process then of taking the data back to the schools, to the communities, to have deep conversations between families and between educators and students as well on the data and what are we seeing, what are we looking at the beliefs, having deep conversations to identify and enact strategies and partnerships ultimately is what we're trying to do, and build this trust through this process to be able to build these partnerships. So this is the methodology. And to sort of break it down again, we contextualize, we look at the different languages spoken at home, gender, ethnicity, disability, education and levels, literacy levels, socioeconomic status, geography, and we map this out together as a team as we're looking at this and understanding the landscape of family, school, community engagement in the communities that we're working with. We then have a surveying process, a survey for families and parents, a survey for educators and teachers, and a survey for students and youth. And these look at the beliefs on education, which I'll break down for you a little bit further, as well as the ways that families are involved, as well as the barriers to being involved. And we have questions on relational trust, which is whether or not educators feel trust with families, whether families feel trust with educators, whether or not students feel trust with educators, because we know that beliefs, we know that involvement in barriers and trust is central to making partnerships that serve students, that serve schools, and that make sure that we are able to sustain and build deep and high quality partnerships. We then have conversations. So a conversation methodology where we look at the data, we talk about the data, we break down some of the beliefs, we have specific conversations towards the data, and then we think of strategies. And some of the strategies that are emerging are very more in the short term, their activities, their counsel, their creative solutions. And some of the teams are working for programs, teacher professional development programs, or other programs that are really making it part of the practice in a school or in a district. And then we have those teams that are also building family school community engagement into their policy, their district policy, their national policy. We're working with a number of teams developing a national policy that integrates family school and community engagement. So there's different ways. When I say strategies, they can be different types of strategies. And they take different amounts of time, but this work has been going on with the teams over a number of years to be able to enact and to get more policy work in place. And finally, just key is, I can't emphasize enough, is that ensuring youth are central to the process. And meaning not just that we're surveying youth, but they're part of the conversation. They're part of the developing of strategies. They're part of reflecting on and understanding why we're doing this work and setting the objectives and what do we expect out of family school engagement. And young people particularly we're working right now with middle school and high school age children, but understanding also that family school engagement is also whether or not a young person wants at a high school level their families to be engaged. And so they're so central to this work. And so I wanted to just emphasize that they're key to understanding all of this research and data. So what are we learning? I'm going to jump now into the beliefs. And I'm going to talk about the 10 of the 16 countries. We have 6 actively in this moment collecting data around the world. And so we will, in December, have all of this data finalized, and it'll be published early in 2024 from across. And so I'm sharing with you some of the preliminary findings that we have co-developed across as a team, and we're as we make sense of the conversation data and the survey data, what do we see as the big aha moments, and what are some of the recommendations? So first part of really understanding families, educators, and students' beliefs, just to emphasize again that this is critical to building relational trust, which I'll break down for you in a minute, and it's really key to building these responsive strategies. So we start the survey process there. We start by, what is the purpose of school? And before I tell you what this data, I wanted to just ask you to, what do you see as the purpose of school? So if you have a cell phone and can scan the QR code, or you can go to Slido, this will hopefully, if all goes well, step out of the way. What do you think? What is the purpose of school? Oh, it's working. Give it another minute so you can see. Give one more minute. All right, how many of you found it was really easy to choose a purpose? Okay, a number of you. How many of you are like, this, I have to choose one, this isn't fair, I can't narrow it down? Still a couple of you. Yeah, and I can talk later in the questions, like why do we force people to choose one? And that's a methodological question, and I'll maybe get to that at the end during the question and answers. But we can see in the room, 50% of us said to understand oneself and develop social skills or values. 25% said to prepare for further education, going on to further education. 14% to be active citizens and community members. 9% other, so this is always fun to have the right. Normally, I don't have it here, but you would write in other, and we would analyze what is the other. And none of you said to develop work skills, which is always interesting in communities to see what doesn't get selected. So what is the purpose? I'm now going to ask you a second question. And it should automatically, does it automatically show for you? If you refresh, it should show you. When are you most satisfied? So the last question was, what is the purpose of school? This is, when are you most satisfied with your child's education? Or you can think about it, your own education. If you're a student, your own education. Or if you're an educator, your student's education. So think about it from your own different, whatever positionality or hat you want. When are you most satisfied with your education or your child's education or your student's education? All right, so it seems again, top is really gaining skills to understand yourselves, develop social skills or values. Learning skills for work was second, 20%. Getting good marks on subjects or exam, there was 15% of you, 10% again other, and 5% is participating in community service and learning, and none in don't know. So let me jump into some data. So this is, again, the purpose. And when are you most satisfied, either with your own education, your child's education, or your student's education? And so I'll talk a little bit, too, about why do we ask these different and how are we analyzing these differently. In kind of the coding, so you'll see kind of when I'm presenting the data, we call sort of the preparing for further education or kind of getting good marks in exams more of the academic. These codes to develop skills for work or learning skills for work is more of the economic. And just to be active citizens and community members, more of the civic, and to understand oneself, develop social skills and values, more of the socio-emotional, right? And so you may not love these labels, but we have to have a way of sort of breaking these down and communicating it across. So what we're gonna go through now is what we're finding across, and then I'll give you some snapshots of particular schools. We found on the purpose of schools for students and families, they see the main role and purpose of school as preparing learners for further education. So the academic really was kind of the high, and civic, socio-emotional, and economic was important, but this really as being the main purpose. And I should say that we have a first phase of the research that was done during COVID, and some of this data has actually changed in the time of when we did some of this research during COVID and now post-COVID. And so academic actually went up post-COVID in our research compared to, there was a lot of families during COVID that were also emphasizing the socio-emotional part of learning. And so this being a main purpose of school. But when we look at educators, they see it quite differently. Right, they see academic learning as important, and you'll see P as primary school or elementary school, or the S is whether or not we're doing secondary schools or high schools or early childhood centers. In the case of Sierra Leone and South Africa and Africa, the academic learning was an emphasis for the educators, but economic learning for high school teachers in Bangladesh and Zanzibar, Tanzania. And in civic learning was actually the largest for educators in Australia, Brazil, Colombia, England, Tanzania, as well as one of the states in India. Socio-emotional learning, Bangladesh, Brazil, and England was the highest for socio-emotional learning. And so we do have US sites that will be part of the publication in December in California. And in the first phase, we had Indiana, we had Pennsylvania, and California, a different district in California as part of the initial research. And so one thing we were finding is that there's a lot of variance about how educators around the world and in communities see the purpose, and there tends to be a trend with families about how they see the purpose of school, and it can change in the moment, and it can change over time. When we looked in a snapshot in Bangladesh, you'll see this kind of mapped out. We look and map it out for schools and communities to dig in, again, the families and students emphasizing the academic, whereas the educators were emphasizing the economic and the socio-emotional learning. So mapping these out and then having conversations, as part of the conversations is how we see these different beliefs and why and what drives our different beliefs. And I can talk a little bit more. One of the families in Bangladesh said, I chose the academic because I'm really worried about my child, and I have high expectations. They're a first generation in school. We're hoping they'll further their education, get a good job, and they'll be able to support the family. So there's also academic is connected oftentimes to families for economic and obtaining jobs and work. And so there's a connection too between the academic and furthering education and the economic for reasons of social mobility and expectations. And this is true across countries. And so we're also looking at that. How do these different purposes interact with each other? But when we look at satisfaction, families, educators, and students were most satisfied across all the socio-emotional, what we call social-emotional. So although they may have different purposes, families and students emphasizing the purpose being academic or furthering education, when it came to when they were most satisfied, they didn't put when they get good marks in exams. Even though in conversations they said, we know how education systems are set up, we know we have to work with the systems we have, but we're actually most satisfied. And this was interesting because it was really across diverse countries, demographics, rural, urban, different demographics of families, but there was a common satisfaction when young people were gaining these skills to understand themselves and develop social skills or values. So it was very, very high. So in Bangladesh, again, you'll see across all the different groups that it really was social-emotional skills. And for digging into this with the teachers, they were saying, we see that the purpose, we give a lot of exams, we know kids are judged by the exams, but we also want to see education in a more holistic. We want to see civic be a part of it. We want kids to have good mental health and well-being. We want that as educators, and families do too. Right? But we see the role of school sometimes is quite different than how we are most satisfied with our own children. And so that's part of what we're digging into in these conversations, is how these different purposes and satisfaction play out. We are also looking at what are the different types of and barriers to parental involvement and family involvement. And so at Brookings and at the Center for Universal Education with our teams, we're also thinking about what is the difference between involvement and engagement, right? And it's not one or the other. It's not a continuum that's definitive into two categories. But we often find that family involvement are those activities with families that are telling parents how to contribute, newsletters that say, do this, or telling them about examinations, or telling them come to these nights, or we're going to give you informational meetings, or sometimes parent universities where we tell families. But family engagement that a lot of teams are striving for is really creating opportunities to listen to families, to understand how they see the purpose of school, but also the things that are working for them, but also their anxieties with schools. And so creating spaces to learn and really listen is what a lot of the teams. India has created listening circles. They do once a month. In Australia, they have different types of assemblies where they're trying to do more of listening. But it's leaning into trying to think about not just creating opportunities where families come and they hear, but they actually have a participation in terms of being listened to and thinking about them as partnerships. So we looked at family and types of involvement and used Joyce Epstein's sort of general typology of family involvement or parental involvement, which falls into family engagement is learning at home, which we often don't think about as being family engagement. But a lot of what families do is they interact with their children at home, right, around learning. Caregiving is part of family engagement. Communicating with teachers in schools is part of family engagement. Volunteering in schools is a part of family engagement and family involvement. So is decision-making, participating in a parent-teacher association or organization or a council. Building community with other parents, with other families across community groups. But when we asked about the different types of involvement, families and educators and students often saw it differently. Families saw themselves as being involved in many of the ways learning at home and the caregiving. And so you'll see the star of sort of supporting or monitoring learning at home was the main way that families said they were engaged, as well as communicating with teachers, but teachers didn't always see or recognize that a huge part of family engagement is that supporting at home because they're not seeing it. And so that has been part of the conversations about how do educators also see the work that families are doing at home, and in supporting that. And realizing that family engagement is not just being a part of a parent-teacher association. That is a small, usually a percentage of families at schools that are a part of that decision-making or volunteering or have the time and the resources to be able to go to school and volunteer. That is not something that is accessible to all families, as part of what I'll be sharing with you. But we looked in Columbia at the 66 secondary schools, the high schools that we've been working with, and we find that, that if you'll see the top, kind of the yellow one under supporting learning at home, which is the families, that was the number one. Students also recognizing that their family's main way of being engaged is supporting children at home. Families and students seeing that, but educators seeing, communicating with teachers and staff, and to lower extent, as you'll see, volunteering and leadership and decision-making is involving a smaller proportion of families. That is not the main way that most families are engaged in their children's learning. And why is this important? I'll talk to you about this a little bit further. It's because it's also recognizing that family engagement is not just in being involved in a parent-teaching association or a school management committee, which is often how it's framed in some of the national policies and the plans that we're working with. And so it's understanding more of the nuance in family engagement. So barriers, when we look at the barriers, and we've categorized some of them in structural and the school level and more of the situational, and some of them cross over, we find that time and technology being the biggest barrier, families not having time. And educators often recognize that, and students know that about their families. They don't have the time. Technology could be cell phone or mobile phone credit access. It could be having an email address or the different ways that schools send information to families, transportation, welcoming environment, whether families feel like they can be welcomed, if they have also they feel like they can show up and be understood if they speak a different language at home than they do in the school. And then there's the situational, the language or literacy level of a family that is a barrier sometimes to feeling like they can participate in conversations in the school. Interest, financial contributions, or health or a disability also being a barrier to participation and level of communication. So when we looked at that, time and technology really were the main barriers. When we looked at the primary schools in Australia as an example, and we're finding that generally families and educators will always identify time as a main barrier. They recognize families are busy, that there's a time crunch. Educators are often parents, they understand that. Literacy and language and cultural barriers was quite high, of recognizing that the barriers of communication between families. But if you look at lack of interest, you'll see for educators it was number 3 barrier. Assuming that families are not motivated, assuming that families are not interested, but actually families didn't see it that way. And they were 10 out of 10. That was the last sort of barrier. They don't see it that way of their not being interested. And so this was also a blame game that often we try to talk about during the conversations is, why is it that teachers are assuming families are not motivated or interested when they're identifying that it's time or other barriers that are preventing them from being engaged? So I thought a student in Bangladesh said this really well, and kind of highlighted this in a conversation, that I have to travel to school by bicycle because my home is around a mile away. It is impossible for my mother to come to my school. My father works as a driver in the capital of Dhaka, which is over 8 hours away. This creates a gap where my school may think parents are not interested in my studies, but in reality, my parents have the willingness to be involved, but they're hindered by the limitations and barriers. And recognizing that as a young person, and also the pressure of being assumed that the parent is not motivated, that they're not engaged, when that's not what's happening. And a caregiver in England pointing out, I have 3 children at 3 different schools, so it's hard to be across all 3. And a lot of single parents pointing out, I have children at multiple schools, and it's just me trying to manage all of this. I can't be engaged in the ways that schools have created for me to engage. And so these are part of understanding during the conversations. Part of what we're doing is also looking at relational trust. How do we understand the data, have the conversation, and build trust with communities? So we look at relational trust in a number of ways. and this is based on some of the research by Brick and Schneider that really looks at respect, whether or not teachers feel like they're being respected by families and families are being respected by teachers, competence, whether or not we think that parents are doing a good job as parents or parents think teachers are doing a good job, integrity, whether or not we're keeping our word with each other, and whether or not students feel like teachers are keeping their word, and whether students feel respected, and care, whether or not we are caring about each other, educators with families, families with educators, teachers with students, and shared vision, the extent to which we think we are sharing beliefs on education and we have similar beliefs, and then perceived involvement. And so we measure all of these different and look at these on the relational trust. And as you'll see in the case of Australia, that, and we're finding this across, that we're finding educators have a lower level of trust with families than families do with educators. And students, we're finding, also are more similar to families and feeling a deeper level of trust with educators than educators with their families. And so part of it is digging into why is this and what is some of the reasons for trust. And as you'll see in this case in Australia, that educators were between low trust and trusting versus families, which were between feeling that they have trust or high trust with the educators. So this is part of the conversation is where is relational trust? Why are some of these differences, and how do we actually build strategies to help understand the barriers and to build this trust? So our strategies, our kind of final finding is that schools communities are actively using innovative strategies. So there's a lot of creative strategies happening, but they're often not visible. They're not often in depth. There's not a lot of communication. There's a need for more communication as well as resources and evidence to understand these strategies. And so what we're kind of pulling out is that families, educators, and communities don't always have a common understanding of family, school, and community engagements. Education leaders might think family engagement is coming to a PTA, a parent-teacher association meeting, versus families of wanting to be seen for the work that they're doing and supporting learning at home. And so also not assuming that the only way to be engaged is through an official route, but also that it's important to understand what's happening in the home with parents. It's in depth, so oftentimes when we talk about family engagement, educators and school leaders will throw more events. Let's do a really big back to school night. How many of you have had to go to, if parents have had to go to big back to school? I'm seeing yes nodding. So these more back to school nights or more engagements or more conferences, right? But that doesn't always mean it's in depth or that it's really building relationships. And oftentimes it's adding more burden onto educators and more burden onto families to show up versus ways that are really building partnerships and really focused on learning and helping young people thrive. Communication, oftentimes the teams across the world are starting with wanting to build better two-way communication, finding that communication is often very one way of telling versus two-way of listening. And so building these communication is really important. And finally, a lack of consistent resources to supporting this. And evidence, I can't stress enough, and that's what we're trying to do at Brookings. Okay, our recommendations, we're looking at mapping underlying beliefs and experiences. How do we identify and how do we map these? We are looking at promoting inclusive opportunities to listen to families. So I gave you a couple of examples of teams around the world. Building greater two-way trust and communication with historically marginalized families. And we're finding a lot of families that feel empowered to engage in conversations, but how do we make this for all families? And finally, making sure that educators, that training, that there's skills and the mindset, the work that you're doing in Nevada to help make sure that educators that have the confidence as well as the mindset of how to engage with diverse families, and ensuring that strategies are really centering on trust and giving the support and the resources that are needed to create these efforts. So these are kind of our big recommendations that we're working to tailor into a lot of our policy work. And what happens when we don't do all this work? We see that we see it in the media, that there's overwhelming conversations on parent diplomacy and overwhelming teachers and focusing on equity, as well as we've heard about the culture wars. And as one superintendent in one of our rural districts in southwestern Pennsylvania put it, that we need these tools to have conversations that cut through the tensions. And for educators, for parents, and for students alike, having these tools to cut through these and to start listening to each other is so critical to the work that we're doing. So thank you, and acknowledgments to all the teams and all the interns and all the hard work that went into this from across countries. And I will end there.
Questions? So we have you on the recording.
So I have
It's on.
two friends who are educators, actually in Colorado. One of them was working for a while at a school that was like primarily like refugee students, not officially, but that was a huge part of their student base. And something she said that was kind of struck me. I was like, I could see it, and I also see maybe some drawbacks too. But her belief was that to mitigate some of the structural issues at home, that they should really like be focusing on extending the school day, having the kids come in for another like a 6-day week. What would you say to that, and like how that fits in with this is kind of like bring the engagement at home in, and that strategy seemed kind of like to take more of that time away. So like I can see both sides of it. Like what would you say to that?
Yeah, I'm curious to what others might think about the idea that if we are in school more and we have more time with kids, that we're somehow going to support better learning. And it's a safer environment. And so I think safety has come up as really a key issue in family school community engagement and make an environment. I would say doing some deep research to understand what is safe, but also what is appropriate for age level, cognitive level of the children also, but also understanding families, right? What does that mean to families and structures and cohesion in families and that? So I think I couldn't comment on like whether I not think it's a good thing or not, but I think that would be a signal of doing some deep research. But with students as well, right? Not just asking the educators and the school leaders, what do they constitute as safety, but what do students think, and also with families. And so there's a lot of dialogues that are, quick solutions to thing. And I think what we're finding with family school community engagement is that we really have to do a lot of deep work to understanding both the barriers to that and the resources that are involved in that, but also the consequences of more time and what does that mean? And ultimately, does that help students thrive? Does it help schools thrive? Right? So there might be others that want to weigh into that too, but I think that's part of what we're trying to do with these conversations. And there's not one solution for all, right? And safety is a real concern with a lot of the family school and community engagement. What is the safest environment for a child, right? And that's it's not an easy thing to answer. So good point, good question.
Question here.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know if this is working. Anyway, from my experience as a kid, a father, and observing my grandchildren, it seems that networks of kids are formed in school, and that's the key involvement of families with school. That is, the networks that the kids themselves create. And have you looked at that at all in terms of how to structure those networks in a way that you get good synergies between the kids, between the families and the teachers, but though the teachers may not be that important in that interaction?
It's a really good kind of the peer-to-peer engagement, and then also families that become engaged around their peer relationships. I think we haven't studied those enough in depth, so that's really an interesting area of research. We do find that we found during the pandemic that this was oftentimes how young people were communicating with each other, and the peer-to-peer relationships were sustaining during the pandemic, and that was often facilitated by the parents and driven by the parents. And so I think that is a really important part, and I think it would fall under kind of the types of engagement, also under caregiving and supporting learning at home as well. But we have found that when educators do also help support those networking of families within. So we have schools that are also having mentoring programs between families where they're setting that up within schools, helping also like newcomer families to a community being mentored and paired up with other families that have gone through the system, that understand the system. And these also can be formal networks that are also formed by the school or encouraging them to take place. And I think during the pandemic, a lot of that informal interaction between families on the playground and other spaces where we've been studying it, they were disrupted. And so those took place in a very different way. And so we're trying to understand too, how do we really build those relationships again among family post-pandemic, which it's an interesting point. But I think the peer-to-peer is really an important part of that as well. Yeah, good question.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to say this was amazing, so thank you so much for your work. But I also have a question. So my research is primarily in maltreated youth who've been removed from their home, primarily in the foster care system. And I guess I've been thinking about, is there a way that you could see some of the tools that you've used to help increase family engagement, increase system engagement when children are removed from their homes and don't have that family, to be able to navigate being more engaged in school?
Yeah, one of the starting points is understanding, thank you for raising that, is that understanding that family, why don't we use parent? Because family is often not just a parent, right, in the engagement. So I think broadening that, you'll still see parental as the main word. In a lot of the countries we're working with, it's caregiver, recognizing it might be a grandparent, it might be a sibling, it might be a foster family of that. So first of all, kind of working with schools to also use the word family versus assuming that the direct conversation is with the parent, but also understanding. And so we're working with a number of countries also where there's children that are orphans that are living with another family in displaced settings, and particularly with some of the communities, displaced communities in Kenya and Uganda we're working with. So we've been exploring how do you understand what's happening, and we've added additional questions to really understand some of the dynamics of what does parental and family engagement look like in a situation where a child is not living with the main caregiver, or sometimes might be living in multiple caregiving households. And so I think part of that is important to the data analysis, but also helping schools understand that. Sometimes it's they know their communities very well, and some of the communities, they know their students, they know that they're moving from multiple households, but we've also found schools where they haven't known that. And they haven't known some of the struggles that young people are going to, and that trauma is part of that. And so some of the conversations are also highlighting of where do we have these conversations. In the case I was sharing earlier in Sierra Leone, they said a lot of the families have trauma with schools. 1 out of 2 in those public schools that we were working with hadn't been to school. They weren't necessarily coming, or if they had disruptions because of the civil conflict with school. And so school can also not just be a safe place for all parents, it can be a source of trauma and not being comfortable. So where do we have these conversations with families? How do we have them? How are we also approaching them as understanding that families have their own trauma? And so these are part of the conversation when we bring the conversations together, but also making sure that we have we will do conversations differently in the communities where there's a large displacement and children are not necessarily living with their primary family. And how we do those conversations are quite different, and working with the community on what's the safest way to listen and feel engaged. And asking students, our student conversations are based on how students want to facilitate their conversations. Do they want to have it all with students? Do they want to be involved with parents or not? And so this can change by community, but I think it's asking the families where are they going to be able to feel that they are most safe in showing up, and it's often not necessarily in the school walls, is what teams, even our teams in the United States are saying that as well, that they're trying to find spaces that don't assume that the best conversation with parents is going to be in the school walls. Yeah, great point.
Question here?
Hi, Emily. Thank you for your presentation. In your experience, how did the integration of faith and spirituality positively impact family involvement in the education context?
Yeah, that's a great question, and we've found, so we looked at it a lot, kind of in some communities, there's a lot of communities that will write in other, and they'll write in their other in terms of what is the purpose of school, right? And so we're also analyzing the other. In some communities, there's a lot of writing in of other. In some communities, there's not a lot of writing. In a couple of communities, though, we've found in a lot of writing in and the other of understanding education as it shows up in faith, right, and the intersection of faith. And so in the case of Zanzibar, where I've been working for a long time, and in the research that we're doing is also understanding what does community mean. When we say family school community engagement, we often think in the US it's a community organization, it's a YMCA, it's a boy and girl club, it's all this. But in the case of context of Zanzibar and Tanzania, community is also the religious leaders. It's just central to that, right? And when they say lifelong learning, they don't mean it lifelong learning in the context of some of the parents in England were saying of, oh, I want to learn a new language or a new art form. It was lifelong learning related to religious learning. So that's part of the analysis that we do during the contextualization part of it, but also unpacking what a community engagement look like, who are the community leaders that need to be a part of supporting schools, and it looks different in different communities. And for a lot of communities, the religious organizations and communities must be a part of these conversations of partnerships because they are so critical to family school community engagement. So it's a great question. And that's part of the work that we do in these conversations and inviting whether or not we want to have community conversations and who should be a part of that and defining that as the research collective. Yeah, great question.
Hi, Emily. Thank you for your presentation. My mother is a school administrator here in Vegas, and I think she would have loved this, so I feel bad I didn't bring her. But I would argue that the school that she serves has a lot more families with those barriers to engagement than perhaps other schools in our community. And it's just an unfortunate reality of how our city is built, I think. And I would also argue that there's a generational aspect to it where parents that perhaps didn't grow up with that engagement themselves struggle to provide that for their children. I don't think parenting is necessarily an innate skill that you're just great at from the outset. So does the burden fall on schools themselves to help parents work through those barriers, or is it on families to try and just work their way out of that hole? Where does the buck stop, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I turn it all to you. Where do you think the buck stops? I also have colleagues from the Department of Education, Alberto and team here to think about like where do we think? And I think that is a really important part. And it's the same for educators. They're saying we don't necessarily know how to engage with all diverse families. Like you go into education and you learn a lot of things, but you don't necessarily know how to. It's not always natural for all educators to engage with families. But I think it's a really important part. There's a lot of interesting strategies that are happening that are really, especially with the community school movements of trying to build that in, and how do we support also families in their own education goals. And so there's teams, the National Council of Family Learnings, that do a lot of family learning and family literacy with schools as part of also seeing that parents can be a part of their own learning and process, but also helping with caregiving classes and parenting classes and all different types of classes. And I think we're seeing that a lot with the community schools globally of that intersection and the need for it. But I think you raise a really important part of the intergenerational. And noticing that parenting has changed with social media, and we have a generational gap too of a lot of parents not comfortable with social media, not knowing how to parent in the age of social media is really one of the fundamental conversations also that is emerging as well. I don't know if Alberto or others want to add into this conversation of what you're seeing as well, or other strategies here in Nevada.
Yeah, so just quick introduction. So I'll work around the education programs professional for family engagement in the Nevada Department of Education.
Please.
And so one thing I would add is, so a common phrase, a common word, a common concept that we see in the family engagement world is the idea of shared responsibility. And I think oftentimes we run into trouble because we want to appoint who's to blame, right? Where does the responsibility lie when something goes awry? And an important part of understanding family engagement and what goes behind it is that this is a shared responsibility, right? It's not the onus of the burdens on one side or the other. But what's more critically important is for educators to have that initiative, right, in understanding and learning more about their families. We have different cultures, and especially here in Las Vegas, where it's just, we have a lot of folks from different countries. And even speaking from my own experience, my mom, who came from Mexico, culturally, just the idea was that, the teacher is the professional, you don't interact or you don't question what the instructor, what the teacher, what rules there are. So your form of supporting your child's education is by not showing up to the school, right? Not asking those questions, because that's not your responsibility. And I truly believe that a part of what we need to do is have that conversation with families and build the capacity of families to, right, open up and teach them a little bit about what this system is and what the expectations are. Because if we don't have that conversation, we're going to kind of see the diversion that we've seen in the data, where there are different groups have different ideas of what the purpose of school is, right? The relational trust piece is. And oftentimes it's just birthed from not having that two-way communication in place. And so, and then the addition of resources, right? When it comes to transportation, right? Families not showing up to certain events, and that's unfortunately sometimes interpreted as, well, the lack of interest or the lack of care. When you're, in some examples, there's one car, and the other parent's using that car in the moment. Or, as we know, now some urban places just don't have great transportation systems, right? And so maybe that's a barrier, work schedules, et cetera. And so really having that conversation, understanding why someone may not be able to attend, or when we make those events available to families that attend. Oftentimes we schedule them, and I did this, unfortunately, as a teacher, right? We schedule them around our typical schedules in mind, versus instead of asking families, when is it the best time, right?
Absolutely.
And so I'll stop there because I kind of
Yeah, well said. Thank you, Alberto. Yeah, and I think it's, I've seen some really interesting strategies the team have been working on. It's also, for what Alberto was just saying, one of the teams had a sheet of, okay, what are some ways that you can be engaged if it's not comfortable for you to talk to the teacher, which oftentimes we're finding across countries and across demographics is not a comfortable thing. And it's a panic sometimes for teachers. Okay, here are some questions that you can ask. And even some of them pictorial in communities where there's low literacy levels, right? Of just helping parents even understand how to approach it, which we often forget and just think, oh, they're going to know what to ask about their child. But that's actually a stress point for a lot, and not wanting to insult the teacher by assuming, you're asking a question, you're not respecting their education. And so part of this is also unpacking these different cultural beliefs that also inform our own backgrounds in education. And we found a team yesterday, I was talking across the schools in Bangladesh, and they were saying we're having a major food crisis post-pandemic, and with labor, with climate and flooding and all of this happening, like we don't have enough food, and families are struggling to even survive. Asking them to do family engagement is like an added, but if we build food into this and talk about supports and how to support each other, and addressing hunger and making it clear that you bring your kids to school. It's okay if you have small children as a parent, you can bring them. It's okay. Just sometimes these rules that we think, oh my gosh, I can't bring my small child, I can't go to the school because I don't have someone to take care of them, or it's the food, and just making sure that these are inclusive events, but we're also talking about the real things that are happening in the lives of families and not assuming, right, that we're not taking those into consideration. So thank you, Alberto.
If you'll join me again in thanking Emily for her time and for this amazing research tonight. I also want to thank you all for the thoughtful dialogue and for coming out tonight. Before we conclude, I want to remind you all, Emily will still be here after the presentation if you have any lingering questions that you would like to ask her. And of course, if you can also mark your calendars for the next talk in our Brookings Scholar Lecture Series this fall, Wednesday, November 1st, we will be inviting our colleague Samantha Gross from Brookings back out to UNLV for, I believe, her third visit. And she'll be helping us to answer the provocative question, why is it so hard for us to quit fossil fuels? So hopefully we'll take the time to come out here again. That is Wednesday, November 1st at 6 p.m., same time, same place here. Have a good night, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks again.